Set 10 drops onto the live servers tomorrow, and for the first time ever, we are doing what's called a pre-meta analysis. What this basically is predictions for the patch, how we feel about the patch, anything that we feel about, that we should talk about in the meta, what might be strong, what might be weak. This isn't necessarily a comp list, but just more of a comprehensive idea of what you can expect within the meta. Obviously, this is very subjective because it's very difficult to just look at numbers and be like, oh yeah, this is strong, this is not. But because especially the PBE cycle was for like 2 weeks, I feel like we have a pretty decent idea as to what the meta is already shaping out to be before the set has already dropped onto the live servers. But before we get into the meta analysis, we have a couple things we need to go over. A little bit of house cleaning, okay? First off, very excited to announce that we have been accepted into the DSG boxbox set 10 bootcamp. So we will be once again competing inside the pro league against a bunch of really insane players, people like Asa, people like K3 Soju, people like this guy's Toast, Dish Soap, Deepay, Emily Wang, Kiyun, Kiting, Mismatch Socks, Piva, rank 1 of Vietnam, Rainplosion rated. A bunch of really insane players are within this list, and as you can see here, we are down here right underneath Wajan Iverson, who went 3rd in the World Champions for set 9. If you are not, super interested in the pro leagues and you want to just like chill, maybe you're a bit more of a casual viewer, but if you're a viewer of mine, I would assume you're, you kind of dig the pro league and the advanced stuff. But if that's not your stuff, there's some really cool people in the advanced leagues and especially the casual league as well. It's just some people inside of the advanced league who are pretty cool and awesome as well. Just shout out a couple people. Jane's in here, Carrie's in here, King Nidog's in here, Christopher Yee's in here, Meteos, C9 Meteos, if you remember him from the League of Legends days, the absolute big 5-head jungler. A lot of really insane names. Wuhujin, if you're in part of the Valorant community, you might recognize him, the Banana Man. Gumi, Jelly, a bunch of really great names. And again, even in the casual league, there's some actually pretty interesting people as well, especially if you are participating in like a bunch of other communities. People like Joel's is probably one of the bigger ones who's part of the Valorant community, but is, really dope guy. You got some other people as well. You have people like Stars Mitten. You even have people like X Chocobars. Like some really cool people. If you're actually part of chess, Aka Nemsko might be a name that you might be familiar with. She is I believe, like an incredibly strong chess player. I think she like peaked like 2350 like FIDE. Like absolutely insane chess player. But really cool that we have these people participating in the league as well. So it's going to be super fun. I highly recommend going to check out everybody's channels during the bootcamp. It's going to be a super fun time. One more thing before we start and talk about different compositions is that there was a micro patch before the patch hits live servers. We've been playing on the PB for a while now. We've been getting used to this patch, but now the micro patch has been released. A little bit of stuff has been a bit more adjusted, so we should quickly talk about the patch and talk about how this might affect the way we approach the next, the patch is coming out, the set when it's coming out to the live within like 12 hours from now. But let's talk about the changes real quick because there's some really important ones that I want to mention. First off, I don't know why they buffed Annie 3 this much. It's like a 55 AP bonus on Annie 3. It's a lot. Annie 3 wasn't really part of the conversation too much in terms of meta boards, at least from what I had seen. But if you find an early Annie, especially with +2 Spellweaver, if you watch the emo headliner video, you would know that Annie 3, especially after these buffs, could actually be quite a menace. You just play into vertical Spellweaver. It's a very simple board, but nonetheless, I'm a little scared about Annie 3 being overbuffed to this degree. Corki gets a bit of an AD buff, which isn't that much to really look at, but Corki has been kind of underperforming relative to other one-cost early game carries, so I do see that being kind of good. Evelyn getting nerfed pretty heavily because Evelyn was definitely one of the premier, if not the premier one-cost carry on your board throughout the early game, so good to see that. Kennen getting a pretty large shock damage nerf as well because Superfan is just super strong. You're seeing Superfan openers all the time. I don't think this is enough to really hurt the Superfan opener, but nonetheless, maybe it's enough. Who really knows? Again, Kennen was very overtuned by himself as a champion, so maybe this is enough to tune down Superfan a bit, but I don't see it really affecting the meta that heavily. Yasuo also getting a bit of a buff as well, so if you're a Yasuo reroll player, maybe consider it, but I still think this Annie buff is pretty fucking insane. I don't really understand why this one cost buff was really necessary, in my opinion. I think it was fine the way it was. For the 2-cost, Bard getting a bit of a buff, reducing the maximum mana it takes for him to cast, so you're going to be able to farm a bit more of those dudes. Bar 3 was already kind of okay. It wasn't amazing. If your spot was good for it, I guess you could play it. But with this, maybe it pushes him a bit more towards actually viable within the meta, although I kind of doubt seeing Guard at the higher echelon of the ladder. Garen is also getting a bit of a buff as well, so we're seeing a bit of a trend with 8-bit getting buffs all around. Not that much to look at though. Kai'Sa spell AD is also getting buffed as well. Kai'Sa 3 was already kind of okay, so I'm kind of surprised seeing this getting buffed as well. A lot of the reroll comps seem to be getting favored here because I guess they don't, especially the 1 cost, 2 costs are not being played that much. So maybe we're gonna see a bit more of this shifting into the meta. Kayle is also getting a bit of a buff as well because her clunky animation is just getting a little bit smoother. So maybe that helps Kayle a little bit. Who really knows? Senna as well seems to be a bit of a nerf because Senna 3 was actually super strong, so glad to see that that is being changed. She was definitely, I think, the strongest 2 cost that you could reroll, at least based off what I could think of, with the only exception being Superfan Gnar. So kind of surprised not seeing Gnar nerfs, but Senna nerfs, I mean, they're welcome. 3 costs, Amumu getting a lot of buffs across the board. Amumu is definitely underperforming as like one of the main supposedly tanks for 3 costs. You have Mordekaiser, Nico, Amumu, and Set. But out of all of them, Amumu kind of felt the worst. Nico's definitely up there in the conversation, but Amumu definitely felt pretty bad. So seeing these really large buffs getting implemented seems to be kind of good for him. So who knows? Maybe Amumu becomes a very strong tank to be playing around in the mid game. Riven is getting a bit of a nerf, which is pretty good because Riven 3 was a little too strong. So glad to see Riven is getting nerfed a little bit. Again, even though Garen and Corki are getting buffed, Riven is getting nerfed a little bit, so keep that in mind. The Caitlyn line is getting buffed a little bit for rapid fire / 8-bit, but not really for, you know, reroll Riven, which is the main line for 8-bit in general. Urgot is also getting a bit of a nerf as well. He's very strong as a 2-star 3 cost that you can play around throughout the mid game. So seeing that he's getting quite a large, actually this is like what, 33% nerf to his spell shield conversion. It's actually quite a large. He's gonna be really squishy compared to before. 4 costs, Caitlyn is getting a bit of a buff again. A lot of 8-bit buffs. 8-bit has been severely underperforming, at least if you've been playing the PvE, you would understand that Caitlyn just feels really bad. So glad to see that that is being charged up a little bit. Poppy is also getting a bit of a buff as well, extra spell armor and extra % heal. I kind of disagree with this. I think Poppy was fine the way that she was. She wasn't like the strongest of 4 cost carries that you could play with like moshers and tanks, but she did already a very great amount of damage. So this actually might push Poppy into like super meta. So I would really like to see this. Again, the Urgot nerfs, they do sort of hurt the way you sort of proceed into vertical moshers. Typically you are playing around the Urgot 2 to stabilize or the mid game, but Gnar 2 has, again, not been nerfed at all. And if you knew anything about Gnar with Superfan, it's super strong. So I'm kind of surprised to see Urgot getting nerfs here, but again, Gnar not getting hit with any. It's a little surprising to me. But nonetheless, I still think playing into the vertical mosher line is going to feel pretty good this patch. Zac as well is also getting a bit of a nerf as well. His heal is just getting reduced. Actually, quite a bit. That is actually quite a lot that is getting nerfed. So Zac might actually be a bit less of a premier 4 cost tank. It really looks like it's going to be a Blitzcrank frontline meta. 5 costs, we have Jhin as well, who's getting a bit of a buff as well, going from 60 mana down to 50 in order to cast his ability. I don't really know how that affects things with blue buff and show Jhin. Off the top of my head, it seems that blue buff seems to be better. 40 versus what, 50 plus 15. Yeah, so it seems that blue buff Jhin is back versus Shojin. Correct me if I'm wrong with that in the comments. I will pin your comment if I am wrong. I hope I'm not. Kayn is also getting a bit of a buff as well. Kayn was already kind of underperforming as like one of the worst 5 costs that you could play around, but hopefully this is enough to push him over the edge. I don't know if it will be, but to be honest, I don't think a lot of people are giving Kayn enough of a fair chance. It's very difficult to find yourself with like a Titans and a JG and a Hodge, or like Archangels, Hodge, and like Spark. Like these items are very specific for Kayn, and there's nobody who can hold it very well before him, except for units like maybe Nico and whatever, but they're not really meta at the moment. Qiyana is also getting a bit of a buff as well, reducing the total mana it requires for her to cast. I don't fully agree with this as well. I think Qiyana is also one of those kind of slept on 5 cost units. She's very strong and is able to proc her ability quite often. Excuse me, especially in the Showtime portal, where you get the +2 true damage and the +2 crowd diver. And if you hit her, or sorry, not the, sorry, I'm thinking of the different one. Showtime is when your chosens appear earlier, like a stage earlier. So if you manage to high roll the Qiyana 2 headliner at level 8, you are printing a shitload of items. So I'm a little worried to see this. It might become a Qiyana fest for that specific portal, I don't really know. But nonetheless, I still think Kiana is really, really strong. I think people just haven't really picked up on how to play it just yet, myself actually included. I've seen it pop off, but I sometimes still struggle to play around the line. As for the traits itself, Country 3 is getting a bit of a nerf. This is just to help reduce how strong Country is at the moment, because Country Reroll is one of the premier comps that we will be talking about later throughout the video. You can see it in the tab up here. But we also have Crowd Diver getting nerfed as well, the damage on dive going down to 300. But I don't think this is really going to change that much when it comes to playing around 4 Crowd Diver, which again, we will be covering it later. Crowd Diver is actually pretty interestingly right now a very strong composition you can play around, and it's definitely something that has kind of recently been discovered within the past day or two. So definitely something to keep in mind. I don't think the damage of the dive is really that important, but again, we'll discuss more about that as we talk about the line. Disco is also getting a bit of a nerf as well. The healing per second, or per 3 seconds rather, is getting nerfed quite a bit, going down a percentage for 3, 4, and 5 Disco. But even at 6 Disco actually. So I don't know how much this is really going to affect it. Maybe you want to keep the Disco Ball in the back line now instead of keeping it in the front line to fortify it in the late game, but that's just something to keep in mind. Edgelord is also getting a bit of a nerf as well, because again, Yone reroll, Riven reroll, it was one of those comps that was like, it was strong if you hit, but if you didn't hit, it was a little awkward. So I like that they're nerfing it a little bit here, because I do think 5 Edgelord is a little too strong. 3 has been untouched, so you can keep that in mind in case you do decide to still play the Riven Yone line. As for the items, blue buff, they're actually increasing the damage amp on takedown. So blue buff getting a buff, I think, is nice. I think a lot of people have sort of been like, blue buff is sort of a shitter item, I'm never going to use it ever again. But now with the Jhin changes and with these increased damage amp on takedown, maybe you want to feel a bit more inclined to start playing blue buff again with Ahri. But again, like I've said before, compared to blue buff, Nashor's Tooth just felt better, in my opinion, but that is just my personal take. We'll see once the item stats do come out, but again, I think Nashor's is better. I don't know if the blue buff changes are enough to change anything, but we'll see as time will tell. Gambler's Blade is also being buffed quite a bit. The base attack speed is going increased up to 40%, and red buff is actually also getting buffed as well with the increase to 8% damage amp. I think this red buff change is terrible. Gambler's Blade I think is necessary. Sorry, I should touch on that real quick. Gambler's Blade, not the best of Ornn items, and in fact, it's actually kind of one of the worst ones. So it's good to see that it's getting buffed. I think it's great, but I do think red buff was already one of the best items in the game. So the fact that they're buffing red buff even further means that, hey, if you can find an early red buff, maybe an item component anvil, like very, very early at like 2-1, or maybe you get double bow because you're offered, you have my bow at 2-1. I think these are very, very viable options to potentially try a win streak by abusing the fact that you got 2 bows at 2-1. Again, very skeptical about this red buff change, but that's just my personal opinion. As for Ornn items real quick, because I do want to go back on this real quick. Ornn items with Gambler's Blade getting buffed is cool, but please bear in mind that there are some very, very strong Ornn items right now in the current meta. Things like Goldmancer Staff, things like Sniper's Focus with Karthus. There are some synergies and just items in general that are just way too strong at the moment. In fact, Mogul's Mill actually feels pretty strong too. You're actually able to proc it during stage 2 quite consistently. So it's a little scary to see that Gambler's Blade is getting buffed and Ornn items are getting a lot stronger. This might affect how we approach What the Forge or even Portal Forge, especially at 2-1, so just keep that in mind. I think a lot of the Ornn items are starting to become really, really strong, so we might see a shift in the meta where Portable Forge becomes a lot more takeable at 2-1, 3-2, and maybe even at 4-1. Or, sorry, 4-2. But moving on, finally, Augmented Little Buddies is getting nerfed quite a bit by a 33% damage, or sorry, HP per little buddy change. Super nice, because Little Buddies is easily like a prismatic value augment instead of a gold one. So really disgustingly strong. Glad to see that it's getting nerfed. The drop is getting disabled. I didn't really have a lot of experience with this, but apparently, according to Mort, it was like a very oppressive augment to be having while you're playing around EDM, which is kind of surprising to see. And Three's a Crowd is also getting nerfed as well, slightly from 100 to 85 HP per 3 cost. I don't fully agree with that, but Three's a Crowd has always been consistently like a pretty strong augment anyways. So, I mean, hey, maybe that was necessary. I don't really know. I very rarely play Three's a Crowd. Whenever I do, I just play 3 cost soup. So that's just the way that I approach it. But anyways, that basically covers the patch. I know that went a little bit longer, but now let's finally talk about some compositions. If you've been following, by the way, the Headliner series, some of these may seem a bit redundant to you, but that's good. That means you're getting familiar with the set, and that is great. First off, we're going to talk about is going to be the Disco vertical. Now, Twisted Fate is going to be definitely one of the premier 4-cost carries. I know that he did get nerfed in the patch, we just went over it, but I don't think that's enough to really put him down to like A tier. I think he's still going to be an S tier carry. He's still going to feel really, really good. Obviously, you just play around Children Archangels, and you just play vertically into Disco. Very simple vertical to play. You want to cap out with 4 Dazzlers and a Ziggs 2 for your secondary carry. Very, very easy to play. Obviously, we are going to talk about this as well when we're talking about Twisted Fate. You can also tech down to 3 Disco if necessary, playing around the 3 Spell Weaver, which isn't really that great. It just looks pretty, but you just get to play the Lulu with the Hyper Pop, which is super important because that opens up the Ziggs. You have Bard in as well for the Dazzle for Twisted Fate. Blitzcrank is your main primary tank with Crown Guard, Declaw, and Redemption. These are, in my opinion, some of the strongest items, but I will say that I think I have definitely been sleeping on Steadfast Heart quite a bit because I do think this item is quite fucking disgusting, especially if you have other tank stats to play around it. The damage reduction works really, really well when you have stuff like a Warmogs or stuff like Declaw or Bramblevest, right? Items that give you stats that can work in conjunction with the damage reduction, this unit is really, really strong. I have fought a lot of 2-1 boards where people are playing around a Steadfast Heart and they have like a Warmog summon, like a TK2. That shit's like unkillable stage 2. So I'm a little surprised to not see Steadfast Heart getting nerfed a little bit, but you know what? It is what it is. I think people are still sort of, you know, waking up to this tech, myself included. But again, very simple board, very, very strong. Again, with the Disco Ball changes as well, I do think that you probably want to keep the Disco Ball in the back, buffing up your backline units rather than keeping it in the front if you had to choose between one another. Obviously, there's a lot of AoE, there's a lot of clumping punishment, so that's something to keep in mind in case you find yourself in a situation where you're like, hey, I don't know if I want to put it in the front or the back. Personally, my take right now is back, but I could be wrong depending on what, you know, the future holds, depending on the patch. This is a pre-meta analysis, of course. Next, let's talk about Karthus Akali, because Karthus Akali is kind of fucking strong. Karthus Akali is easily also going to be one of the stronger comps. I think this comp in particular did not get touched by anything. Karthus Akali is super duper strong in the current meta just because Akali is just able to just be holding any 80 items that you find. Karthus is really, really strong for that backline access because of the way that its ultimate works. And 5 Pentakill is just sort of the main line, but you have a bunch of different ways to play it. You could play 7 Pentakill. You could play Pentakill Spat with Akali. There's a bunch of different ways to approach this line, and it's super, super flexible. I will also mention that there is some tech going around right now that isn't exactly Karthus Akali, and I actually did not even make a board for this because this is actually something that I learned earlier today. I believe somebody who was playing in the in-houses today, who I am blanking on their name at the moment, I truly apologize, but they had leaked the tech to me. But basically the idea is you play double Karthus, which is super, super strong. The idea behind double Karthus is that basically with double Alifron, I believe is their name. So shout out to you, bro. He did say to leak his name if I ever mentioned him in the video. But this shit is like surprisingly super, super strong. It definitely caught me off guard, to say at the very least. Very simply put, you just play around 7 Pentakill. Super, super obvious. But the idea is that the way that Karthus' ability works is that he gains 10 mana for each unit that dies. But here's the thing. If this Karthus and this Karthus ulted the same unit and that unit dies, they both get the 10 mana. So I don't know if that's really an intended feature, but because of this interaction, having 2 Karthuses on your board is actually pretty nice because they're able to just regenerate mana for each other by being able to kill a bunch of units. So this is something to really consider as well. I think it's a really interesting take on the current lines. Definitely something to try out in my opinion, but it's definitely hard to hit because obviously what like 2 Karthuses, it's a very niche sort of line to find because, you know, a lot of the time you're contested for these 4 costs. Not a lot of 4 costs in the pool. There's only 10 in the pool. So that's, you know, it's going to be a little difficult. But nonetheless, very, very cool line. And I think we'll definitely see double Karthus being sort of, I don't want to say abused, but definitely being used as the patch progresses starting tomorrow. Moving on, 4 Crowd Diver. Now, this is sort of the big one that a lot of people have sort of been talking about, but not really talking about. But there's a lot of really interesting 4 Crowd Diver tech. The main sort of one seems to be Katarina 3, but there's a bunch of different ways to play it as well. Katarina 3, you just play 4 Crowd Diver, and then you just play it into 3 country. This is just country reroll with 4 Crowd Diver. The idea is that 4 Crowd Diver actually just the jump from 2 to 4 is insane. It's not because of the magic damage that you're dealt. Again, when they die, they leave, and they're doing not 400, 300 damage because of the post nerf. This website has not been updated yet, but Going from 2 to 4 Crowd Diver, that 30% bonus damage is an insane amount. 2 Crowd Diver is very minimal. Does not really do much for you. But if you manage to hit the 4, suddenly your Crowd Divers are doing a shitload of fucking damage. So Katarina 3 is definitely sort of like the main line that you can find. You don't have to play around this country reroll line. I think this is just an option. You have a bunch of different ways to play around for Crowd Diver. It's super flexible. This is again another way to play around it. This is just with Sentinels. Sentinels I think is super nice because your Crowd Diver units, they're just kind of like face thinking. They're in the fucking midst of the battle. They're right in the middle of it. So honestly, you're getting a little bit of resistance onto them is pretty nice. You play around the Z2, you play around the Kiana 2. I don't think I would really play this line though unless you found the Kiana 2 pretty early. It's kind of one of those boards that you pivot into. Let's say you're playing Moshes, but then you find the Kiana 2 really early on, then you can pivot into 4 Crowd Diver. But that's usually the way that I've been approaching it and I've been finding a decent amount of success. Obviously, like I said before, this is a very flexible board. So this, for example, you could look at this as like your front line, and then again you find that Kiana 2, you try to pivot, and then suddenly you just start taking in backline units, taking the Ziggs for some extra AP damage, taking the Sonas, you want to get that extra attack speed going on for your whole team. Lulu for hyper pop as well, totally fine, makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of different ways to play around this line, and I highly recommend exploring it because I think it definitely has potential to not take over the meta, but definitely be an S tier board to be playing around. Obviously, we can't talk about 4 Crowd Diver without talking about 6 Crowd Diver, and 6 Crowd Diver, by the way, super fucking strong. I'm gonna take a sip of water, by the way. I've been yapping for like this whole time. I don't know if you can tell, but like, I haven't been talking too fast in my opinion, but I've been talking fast enough that I'm like, I gotta like swallow spit. And I mean, that might be TMI for you. But now you know. And so, you know, getting a little bit of water in between is kind of nice. You should try it sometime. This is hard. But going back to this, 6 Crowd Diver again, super strong. Bunch of different ways to play a variation in the backline. You can also play Illusion in the back with Bard for Dazzlers. Super easy to play into. Senna is really great because it gives you the true damage for Kiana. You definitely want at least 2 true damage if you're playing around the Kiana unit, just because Kiana does a lot of damage. True damage is super strong. You can even potentially play into 6 true damage. I've seen it do well, but it definitely loses to like 2-star 5-cost Bill Gate boards, so just keep that in mind. Depends on the lobby, depends on the pace. But moving on, going over to Edgelord Reroll. Now again, this board has been nerfed quite a bit. It was definitely like SS tier before if you managed to hit all the conditions for it, but now it's a little bit harder to play around. Previously, you would just play 5 Edgelord, but because of the debuffs, or rather, yeah, the nerfs for this composition, I'm not entirely sure if this is how you want to play it anymore, but to be honest with you, I don't really see 4 Sentinel being that much better than just playing 5 Edgelord. I still think the jump in 5 Edgelord makes a lot of sense. It's still 15% bonus attack speed, but maybe the bonus armor and MR when you bump up to 4 Sentinel is better for that extra sustain. Again, not really sure what is better. This is in fact a pre-meta analysis, but I'm just shooting out options just so that you can keep in mind. We haven't really been talking about itemizations in general, but these items in particular are something I want to talk about. Red buff is actually kind of strong from what I've seen. I've seen it very few times, but the times that I've seen it has been really great. QSS is great, Titans is great, GA is amazing if you ever hit Not Today as an augment. Very strong augment to be playing around. I think it's so good for Edgelord Reroll, but you have a bunch of different options that you can flex around, and I think it's totally viable. Again, I don't think the nerfs really affect the viability of this comp. I still think it's going to be an S tier comp, but whether 4 Sentinel or 5 Edgelord is better, I won't really know until the stats come out. That's just the reality of the situation. Finally, let's talk about Country Reroll. Country Reroll is sort of one of the more premier 3-cost rerolls as well, where you're playing around Samira and Urgot Reroll. The idea being is that because the Country Hecarim, or rather the Dead Steed, is going to get stronger as you start up your units, you can just reroll the Country units and just have a good time. 5 Country is pretty easy to hit. Obviously, you would ideally want to get the Country +2 on one of these Country units. Ideally, in a perfect world, it would be +2 Country on Samira. The reason being is because her Headliner effect does give you bonus crit, and in fact, without an IE, you could actually do like Guard Breaker, Hodge, and like QSS or Last Whisper, and you'll still hit the 100% threshold, which is super nice. There has been a bit of discussion, by the way, that IE just happens to still be BIS on Samira anyways, so you can try to keep that in mind. While I do know, yes, Executioner 2 does let your ability crit, apparently IE is still surprisingly very strong on her. I've also heard some discussion of Ginsu Samira. I don't fully agree with this, but it is a topic of discussion. So I'm just throwing it out there in case you find yourself with a Ginsu. Like, how the fuck do I use this Ginsu? I'm not playing around a Misfortune. Well, maybe throw it on a Samira, see what happens. But I've heard some people say good things about it. I've heard a lot of people say bad things about it. Me, myself, and my study group, I believe, I shouldn't speak for them, but I'm gonna anyways. Don't think it's very good, but maybe it is. I don't know. But anyways, that'll basically do it for this video. I'm not going too in-depth with the compositions, but if you want me to go a bit more in-depth with these boards, with the itemizations and how to approach them, let me know in the next video and we'll talk more about it. Again, this is a pre-meta analysis, so we don't know all the stats just yet, what's BIS, what's WIS and whatever, but obviously once we know, then I'll talk a bit more about that and lean more into it. So if you find like this went by a bit fast, let me know. I would love to hear it. A lot of feedback is appreciated. But that'll basically do it for this pre-meta analysis. We will be streaming tomorrow, by the way, 6 a.m. Eastern at like November 21st when the set comes out. I shouldn't remember what day that was. But we're going to be streaming. I'm literally like, I'm about to like fucking throw this shit into DaVinci and then just like knock out and then wake up and then, oh, hello, grabbing my donkeys and then fucking hopping on. But hopefully I'll see you guys in the morning. It might be 6 a.m., it might be like 6:30, it might be like 7. I don't really fucking know. It depends. Historically, according to Reddit, it was like 7:20 in the morning Eastern. But who knows? Ramblin says it's 3 a.m. PST, so I don't fucking know. But anyways, that'll do it. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, take care, guys. Hope to see you guys tomorrow for the boot camp, and I will see you guys all later. Take care, guys, and happy climbing.